Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm bringing you some book recommendations for the Readathon Non-Fiction November. However, these are all just going to be general non-fiction recommendations, so even if you're not taking part in the Readathon, I think there's going to be something for everybody here. So, Non-Fiction November, for those of you who don't know, is a Readathon that is hosted by the wonderful Olive from A Book Olive that happens for the entirety of November, and the whole point to it is to try and increase the amount of non-fiction that you read across the month. If you read not much, then the idea is to read a little bit more, and if you read a lot, the idea is to maybe try and read exclusively non-fiction for the whole month. Now, the Readathon always comes with a few prompts, and these are just 4 individual words, and it's up to you how you want to interpret them. I've already released my TBR for this year, so I'll put that down below in the description if you want to check out what I'm planning on getting to. But I was scanning my shelves for some books that I've already read that I think would fit into these prompts, so I can give you guys some recommendations if you do want to take part. I have 3 books for each one of the prompts, 12 in total. The first word is design, and for this one I've got a bit of a variety of things. So the first book I can recommend for you is Slugfest, which is a history of Marvel and DC Comics and kind of the rivalry that they've had over the years. I read this one last year for Non-Fiction November and it is absolutely fantastic. I actually listened to an audiobook and I blitzed it in like 2 days straight. I think it might be the quickest I've ever got through an audiobook. It is absolutely fascinating. Marvel and DC are definitely 2 of the biggest kind of titans when it comes to comic books in the comic book publishing world, and a lot of these subsequent publishers out there like Image, I think is one of them, have kind of come from Marvel or DC, and the various artists and writers and colorists who have come from them and sort of branched off on their own. It's really interesting to look at how the different superheroes have been impacted by various kind of cultural movements and sort of the zeitgeist of the time, the various rivalries that there have been over the years, how kind of the image that the 2 have portrayed, and it just generally was a really fascinating book in general. It's the kind of thing that I think if you weren't interested in comic books, you still would find some enjoyment of, but I definitely think it would be helpful to have a vague background knowledge of the comic book world. To be honest though, with the rise of Marvel Cinematic Universe being so popular and then DC doing so much stuff, I think that the kind of characters in question are so ingrained into our pop culture now that even if you aren't a massive comic book fan, you're going to find something interesting in this. And if you just are interested in like the publishing world in general, I think that this would be a really interesting one. The next book I'm going to recommend for design is about how we design ourselves in the world, specifically women, and this is The Beauty Myth by Naomi Wolf. This is how images of beauty are used against women. It's a feminist text that is looking at the ideals of beauty in the beauty industry and how they are directly harmful towards women, but also how this then leads to problems for men. This is now a little bit of an old book. I read it in university, and so let's find out when it was published. Yeah, it was published in 1991, so naturally it is a little bit dated in places. Some of the statistics are going to be out of date, but this is a really interesting place to start kind of sort of considering feminism and beauty, and I read it in 2014 and still found it very interesting and relevant today. So, you know, that's only a few years ago, so I definitely would recommend it. It's a relatively light reading when it comes to the writing style, although the content can get a little bit intense in places, so it's just something to be aware of, and I think it's a really good place to start as maybe like an intro to some of the feminist texts out there, because Naomi Wolf is very approachable with this. The final one I have to talk about is about architecture, specifically about the architecture of rock lighthouses, and that's Sea Shaken Houses by Tom Nicholas. This is a lighthouse history from Eddystone to Fastnet. This is about 10 rock lighthouses in particular. So these ones are built on rock formations out actually at sea, so not on like a cliff's edge that you can walk up to. You need a boat or a helicopter to just get to them in the first place. This has been very popular recently. It was kind of Waterstone's big book of the month kind of push that they were going for, which is where I did pick it up. I enjoyed it. I actually listened to this on audiobook as well, and I'd really recommend the audiobook. I think the narrator is lovely, has a really lovely light northern burr that just made it very satisfying to listen to. I've heard some criticisms of this book that it's a little bit repetitive, and I would definitely agree with it on that front, so I think it would be better to kind of take it almost like as a collection of essays to be read sort of over a longer period of time, rather than like specifically reading it from cover to cover. It also has a fair amount of what I call like self-insertion non-fiction, which is where the author talks a lot about their relationship with the topic in question and their their experiences researching the topic in question. This is something I don't personally like in non-fiction, so for me it did bring the rating down a little bit. However, if you do enjoy that fact when people like do kind of put themselves and their story into the non-fiction, which I know a lot of people out there do like, then you will enjoy this one because that does feature quite heavily. Still very, very interesting and fascinating, kind of learning about how lighthouses have been designed over the years. So the next topic is sport. That's the next kind of key word, and I have 3 books for you. Now, what I'd say about this particular one is I feel like there's been a lot of people in the booktube community when hearing the word sport kind of, I don't know, like freaking out a little bit, not being too keen to read like very, very sport based text. I do feel just kind of as a community and a collective, we're not very sporty people. So I've really purposely included 2 sporting books in here that I think are excellent things to read even if you're not personally interested in the sport itself, because they're just interesting stories or interesting information rather than worrying about like whether you are very, very into that sport. I'm not a sporty person, but I loved both these books and gave them both 5 stars. So I just want you to kind of bear that in mind when approaching some of the sport books out there. The first one was a total surprise when I read it. I was not expecting to enjoy it. It was a challenge from my partner, and it is Kurt Angle, It's True, It's True. This is the autobiography of Kurt Angle, who is a very famous wrestler. He was both very prolific and successful in the amateur wrestling world, picking up gold in the Olympics with a broken neck. Yes, you heard that correctly. This is why you need to read this book. It's such a cool story. And then he also went on to be a very big name in the pro wrestling world, wrestling against various people like The Rock and people like that. He is an incredibly intelligent gentleman who has a level of self-awareness and kind of introspection about his career and his life that made this such a fascinating read. I've never watched wrestling, whether it be pro or amateur, literally never been interested in the world at all, and I could not put this down. Like, I stayed up till 2 a.m. to finish it. He just has such a wonderful writing style, and it's such a fascinating story of like a man's determination to be the best that he can be, and his training regime was fascinating to read about. He includes so much like interesting information about the pro and amateur wrestling world and kind of the differences, and just it doesn't pre-assume any previous knowledge, so it is a really lovely intro book to that world. I'm not now interested in wrestling. I'm not going to watch any of it. It's not something that I've like continued to read about after this, but this was such a good book and like a really good example of how an autobiography can be really engaging and fascinating even if you aren't personally interested in the topic in question, because the writing just keeps you so engaged. And he really toes that lovely line between like enough autobiographical detail surrounding the interesting thing that he's been doing about his family and everything to kind of give a context without boring you to death about his childhood or random asides that we don't care about. So I really, really recommend this book. I think it's fantastic even if you aren't into wrestling, because I was not, and I loved it. The other one that I want to recommend is Soccernomics by Simon Cooper and Stefan Szymanski. This is about the economics behind football or soccer, and various sort of examples in football about why things don't kind of play out the way that they do. So it's things like why transfers fail, why Spain rules the world, and all sorts of other kind of curious phenomena. How much impact do managers actually have, the finances behind football. It's just generally a really interesting book. I'd say check out the latest edition, because I don't think this is the newest one, and they have updated it a few times. So if you do want the most up-to-date information, definitely obviously check out the latest version that they put out. It's really easy reading, and again, it doesn't presuppose any knowledge about the football world, and you don't have to be into football to find it fascinating. It really more is looking at the social, cultural and economic things behind football rather than specifically what's happening on the pitch. So I'd heavily recommend this. Really, really cool. And if you're looking at this being like, Emma, I get it, sports books are cool, but I don't want to read about sport, it's okay, I have another one for you, and that is It's All a Game by Tristan Donovan. This is a history of board games and includes things like competitive board games, so it counts as a sport. Yay, we made it fit. I loved this book. It is so riveting. It goes all the way back to some of the very, very ancient board games. It looks at like the evolution of chess and how it's become what it is today, how board games can reflect what's going on sort of culturally or in our society, and what values we have. It contains the infamous story of how Monopoly was originally a board game that was supposed to be condemning capitalism rather than being and like renting and being a landlord and things like that, and now it has been kind of warped and changed into being almost a celebration of that. It talks about the rise of sort of newer board games these days and kind of the revival the board games are happening. And again, really easy read, really lovely, very well researched, very well written, and just absolutely fascinating. So if you're really adamant that you don't want to read about sport, maybe maybe check this one out instead. The next prompt is true, and this is lovely and broad and very, very wide. So I've decided to take this as a little bit of like a things that are slightly stranger than fiction, can't believe that they're actually true. The first one I have for this is The Great Leader and the Fighter Pilot by Blaine Harden. This is the true story of a Korean soldier who flew a plane over the like sort of over into enemy territory and landed it and became like hailed as a hero, and basically got to go and live in America. And it's also interspersed with the rise, like the history of the rise of North Korea and the divide and why the war with South Korea happened. Absolutely fascinating, really well written, and again it's just kind of a glimpse into a world that we in the Western world really don't get to see much about, and kind of a part of history that I didn't know much about before going in, and just very, very well written, an incredible book. And it's a story that is almost incredible to like too incredible to believe, and I think it's just a fantastic tale in general, so I would really, really recommend it. Now I'm kind of recommending an author rather than a particular book for you, but basically if you really like science that is baffling and stranger than fiction, like cannot believe that this actually happens, I would recommend pretty much any of Mary Roach's books. I have two here. This is Stiff and Grunt. These are some of the best non-fiction I've read this year. I think they're amazing, and I've promptly gone and added the rest of her back catalogue to my want to read list. Mary Roach is fantastic at picking a topic, whether it be human cadavers or the crazy science of trying to keep people alive in a war, and just exploring and looking at the various different kind of examples of this. So this book includes things like using bodies as crash test dummies, crazy examples of cannibalism in the past, and all sorts of other funky things like that. This one includes things like how can we fend off sharks, submarine rescues, various like limb reconstructions, which includes males' genitalia. It's just, they're insane. They're fantastic. She has a lovely writing style. It's all really interesting stuff, and just very light and easy to read. I feel like non-fiction gets such a label of being like dense and boring and like school, and Mary Roach is here to tell you like, guys, we can have a laugh whilst we're doing this. She's really, really great. She has other books out there which include one on like the human stomach, the science behind sex. There's definitely another one that I really want to read and I can't remember what it is. Stuff to do with the paranormal. She's got tons out there, so I'd really recommend giving a quick scan and just finding one of hers that really appeals, because they're great. Of these two, I think Grunt was more interesting, but they're both amazing. 5 stars. Okay, and then the last one for true is the true story behind the British law system, and that is The Secret Barrister by Anonymous. This is stories of the law and how it's broken, and it is an in-depth look from an actual barrister of how the British law system works and some of the issues with it, but some of the ways that it does a pretty good job. And this, like, very popular book, very well known. He has a Twitter as well, which is fantastic. Go follow him, especially given everything that's happening with Brexit. He has some fantastic insights about the legalities of a lot of things happening. Very, very interesting. I'd say more dense than a lot of the books that I'm recommending here. It was a bit heavy going in places and a bit heartbreaking and harrowing in places, to be honest. Like the law really does not work in a bunch of ways, and is horribly underfunded and horribly overworked, and results in a lot of abuses in the system, and that's really, really unfortunate, but it's also worth learning about, and this was absolutely fascinating to read. So would really recommend. We're getting there. 12 books is quite a lot. So the last section is voice, and so I've picked 3 books which are giving a voice to people who I don't think get to speak out very often or don't get to hear their story told. The first one is TheFive by Hayley Rubenhold. I listened to this on audiobook, and this is the story of the 5 women who were the victims of Jack the Ripper, and this is telling you their story, which got completely twisted and manipulated by the media, both during the day and also subsequently, and it's trying to cut through the mythology of the Jack the Ripper figure and instead look at the women behind that who were genuine people who had lives that were cruelly ripped from them. It also functions in a way of being able to give you like a real in-depth look of the kind of a social history of the Victorian era for the working class, using each of these women as a way of kind of taking a snapshot and being able to zoom in to what it would have been like in that time to live in that era. Absolutely fascinating, done with such respect and so clearly well researched. Really, really fascinating book, and would definitely recommend it. The audiobook as well is absolutely phenomenal, so I'd really recommend it in that format too. The next one I have is Never Enough The Neuroscience and Experience of Addiction by Judith Grisel. This book is about the science behind addiction, but the one thing that makes it really interesting and unique, I feel like, in the science world is because it is written by an ex-addict who was a hardcore addict, and really we're talking like pretty much every drug, getting to the lowest of the lows, very intense. It really is, it's going through and it is looking at the science behind why various drugs are addictive and what they do to the human body, and some of the science behind addiction, whether it comes to like whether you can be like predisposed to it or not. What I'd say about it is it's surprisingly light to read, even if you don't have a massive science background. Now, the last time I did anything kind of sciencey was AS level biology, and I found it relatively easy to follow and get into. I have read a few science books kind of more recently, so it's kind of one to consider, but what I'd say is don't get freaked out by the amount of like technical jargon in it, because actually it's not that technical in the grand scheme of things. There's quite a few diagrams and things that when you're flicking through can maybe spook you a little bit, but it's really not that sciencey, and you don't need to know a crazy amount about the science. I promise. It's surprisingly accessible as far as science books go. I found it just, again, incredible, amazing, stayed up really late to try and finish it, just such an intense read, and looking at like giving a voice to something which society we do just kind of shun, and like addiction is almost treated like, you know, well, they should know better, and how did they end up in this position, and why can't they just fix themselves? And you're being like, no, you really, there's a lot of biology involved and a lot of forces that are very difficult to fight against. So really, really interesting book. And the final one is Confessions of a Sociopath by M.E. Thomas. Sorry about the sticker still being on it. This is the memoir of a sociopath, talking about her diagnosis and then how her being a sociopath has impacted her relationships, and trying to break down that stigma that sociopath equals criminal or violent criminal or anything like that. I read this a while ago, so I can't really remember a ton of the details, but I do remember really enjoying it at the time, and I wanted to include another memoir in here because I tend to not read many of them, and this was one that I definitely did enjoy, so those are always quite noteworthy when I do find them. So yeah, a fascinating look, and again, it's giving a voice and it's somebody telling from their own story and own perspective, so it does fit nicely with this prompt. Okay, so that is it from me, just a bunch of non-fiction recommendations. Do let me know in the comments down below if any of these have jumped out at you as being ones that you're keen to do. Are you doing non-fiction November? I know a bunch of you are, because you've already commented on some of my videos that I've released recently about this. I'm doing a lot of non-fiction on my channel at the moment, which is awesome, and I'm thinking about doing, because I've read a bunch of science books recently, I'm thinking about doing a non-fiction recommendation for some of my favourite kind of books about science or biology or medicine or things like that. So let me know if you'd be interested in that down in the comments. That's it from me. Have a wonderful reading week, and I'll chat to you soon. Bye!